There are so many things I could talk about when it comes to Pac-Man, but for today I'll be focusing on the scoring systems in the original Pac-Man and the Championship Edition. Really, this video isn't about Pac-Man at all though, and it might be best if you think of it like a thought experiment about scoring systems in single-player games. For now, let me just say that I think Pac-Man is one of the greatest games of its era, and I don't mean that in a condescending, it was great for its time sort of way. It's still a very fun game, and I encourage everyone to give it a go if you haven't already. As with many arcade games, the draw of Pac-Man was achieving a high score through skillful play. To do so, players have to stay alive as long as possible and consume dots, fruit, and ghosts to increase their score. The idea was, of course, that you and the other people at the arcade would have a back and forth competition to be at the top of the table. It's a simple enough system, and one which proved to be a big hit with a lot of people back in the day. As with many old arcade games, you're not supposed to beat Pac-Man. Much like Tetris, Pac-Man is a game you can only lose. At least that's the way it was intended to be. When a game needs to track a number, it has to hold it in a variable. And if the programmer is building the program in an ideal way, a variable will only be as large as the largest number it will ever need to hold, so as to leave more memory free for other variables. Computers back in 1980 had much more humble capabilities, so the variable used to count the levels in Pac-Man is only a single byte large. This means it can only hold 256 values. The developers didn't predict anyone would ever make it that far. If a player reaches the 256 level of Pac-Man, this variable rolls over its limit and breaks the rest of the game. All of this is to say that Pac-Man can be beaten. It has a maximum score of 3,333,360 points, and there are patterns available online which can help people achieve it. So, if the highest score possible has already been achieved, then there's no room to compete anymore, but this is where we talk about the next game. Pac-Man Championship Edition was created by the original designer of Pac-Man, so it comes as no surprise that it's a very worthy sequel. There's some brilliant tweaks, such as the level which now changes dynamically as the player acquires dots and fruit. Additionally, dots no longer appear on the entire board, and this is where things get interesting. I'm going to be using the Championship 2 board here since it best illustrates my point, although I'd say it applies to the other boards as well. Since the dots are limited, and in very specific arrangements, this means the optimal path through each area is obvious. The idea is to eat the dots, accumulate a chain of ghosts, and get to the opposite side to eat the fruit as quickly as possible. This process is repeated over and over as the game goes on. The boards are often designed so that the dots flow logically from one side to the other, creating a smooth playing experience. With the optimal path made clear, you might think this would be boring, but the catch is the 4 iconic ghosts from the original game which wander around and inevitably throw the player off track. Skill comes into play in avoiding the 4 roaming ghosts, but here's where we also run into a problem. Although many additions were made in Championship Edition, the biggest one by far is the inclusion of a timer. Players choose to play for either 5 or 10 minutes before the game begins. If you have a limited amount of time in which to score points, then time is points. Any moment in time where you're not scoring points is objectively less valuable than a moment in time where you are scoring points, unless the moment where you don't score eventually leads to you scoring more than you would have otherwise. In other words, since there's an optimal path, everything else is suboptimal. As soon as one of the wandering ghosts gets in our way and slows us down for even a second, our score becomes suboptimal. Let's imagine that a skilled player would have no trouble making it through the optimal path if there were no roaming ghosts. This wouldn't be a hard task by any means. Now, let's also imagine 2 different scenarios. The roaming ghosts can either be deterministic, meaning their behaviour is entirely predictable based on the player's actions, or they can be unpredictable thanks to a random number generated which can influence their pathing. In the first situation, where the ghosts are deterministic, it means that players could eventually find the set of movements which works out best. In other words, they find the right pattern, execute it, and achieve a perfect score. We can change this by giving the ghosts a random, unpredictable element which forces the player to think on their feet. This might sound like a good thing to begin with, but it also has a problem. Remember, the player in our hypothetical scenario would have no problem sticking to the optimal scoring path if not for the ghosts. This means, since the ghosts will randomly cross or avoid the player, that their score is ultimately determined by luck. if the ghosts all stay out of the player's path for the full 5 minutes, then they get a perfect score. But if ghosts get in their way, then the run becomes suboptimal. This is a catch-22 situation. At high levels of play, neither AI solution will solve the problem. A long time ago, nobody even considered that somebody would get to the 256th level of Pac-Man, so it's not inconceivable that someone will do something similar with Championship Edition too. After discussing Championship Edition, it might seem that the original Pac-Man got it right after all, but that's not really the case either. In 1999, when the first perfect score for Pac-Man was achieved, that wasn't the end of competitive play for that game. Others set out to also get a perfect score, only this time they did it faster. Top players of Pac-Man don't even compete for scores anymore, they compete for times to get to the maximum score. The biggest, most game-changing addition to Championship Edition was the timer, but in reality, players of the Arcade Edition had already started using timers of their own. This brings with it all the problems I just talked about for Championship Edition. The problem the two games share is that they both end, which results in the element of time being added to the equation. So let's imagine another hypothetical, where the original Pac-Man works as intended. There's no timer and no game-killing bug. In that case, a player could continue to play until they run out of lives. The ghost's behaviour in Pac-Man is deterministic, which proves to be problematic in this instance. Once you hit the 21st level in Pac-Man, you can play all the remaining levels the same way in order to reach the end, since the behaviour of the ghosts doesn't change. For a skilled player, this won't provide any challenge, because they'll practice the pattern until they get it down, and then just repeat it ad infinitum. With no challenge, this means the player will never die, and the game will never be over. This turns high score competitions into an endurance challenge of who can play the game the longest, which isn't really what we wanted. I mean, if that's all the game is going to test, then we may as well resort to physical sports instead. In fact, in the original version of Pac-Man, this would be even worse than an endurance challenge, because Pac-Man has a sweet spot where he can't be hit by any of the ghosts. This means players can idle in the sweet spot if they need to take a break, and come back to the game later. This would mean that the game would never ever end, even if the player had to step away from it. Eventually, we're turning this high score competition into a competition of who has the most stable power supply. Pac-Man helps to raise all of these questions thanks to the simplicity of its movement. It's well within the realm of possibility for a player to achieve a perfect score. These same thoughts can be applied to many arcade games, however, and I think this highlights the ideal way that scoring should be handled in other arcade-style games. In essence, it comes down to two elements: the way the challenge is presented, and whether or not there's a restriction on time. The only way to solve the problem completely is to have dynamic challenge, but no restriction on time. This table here might do a better job of explaining it than I did. When we factor in the way we can handle the challenge and the way we can handle the time limit, there's only one solution which works perfectly. I use the word dynamic here for a reason, because strictly speaking, the challenge doesn't necessarily need to be created using a random number generator. When I say that a challenge should be random, what I really mean is that the game should be dynamic and difficult enough that a player can never fall into a pattern, or series of patterns, which removes skill from the equation. Players should have to think on their feet, even if only occasionally, to ensure that a skilled player outlasts an unskilled one. Unfortunately, this is where the Pac-Man games fall down, thanks to the limited movement options of both the player and the ghosts. Even something as simple as Breakout can achieve dynamic difficulty, and it does so without using a random number generator. When hitting a ball in Breakout, the ball behaves in a deterministic way, but the angle it bounces at is determined by where it hits the paddle. Even very skilled players will eventually be out of position and have to deal with a trajectory they didn't expect, throwing the whole game off course. The issues I've raised in this video really only affect the top percentile of players, and Pac-Man is a very specific example. Thankfully, there's many games out there that are challenging and complicated enough that these issues will never come to light, but it never hurts to consider the future when developing. Most games today are very complicated compared to Pac-Man, but some mini-games and smaller downloadable titles might need more consideration about how their scoring systems might be broken. It took a long time for anyone to get to the kill screen on Pac-Man, but it happened in the end. Eventually, as long as it's still being played, someone will score a perfect game of Pac-Man with a perfect time, after which there'll be no reason for other top players to compete anymore. A game might seem impossible to complete perfectly today, but that won't necessarily always be the case. For example, if neural-based input were to become the norm, then the skill level of most players might increase dramatically, since they'd no longer be restricted by physical controllers. Previously unbreakable games might be shattered overnight. Some arcade games are a lot of fun even when not competing for a score. I'd count Pac-Man among them, but hopefully the games built today won't have maxed out scoreboards in 20 years' time. If nothing else, the memory restraints aren't as harsh as they were in the days of Pac-Man, which has allowed smart designers to stick a few extra zeros on the end of the high score counter, just in case.